Hello, this is the recorded lecture for Labour Law and Law of the Workplace for Kent Law School on the 30th of September 2010. I apologise for the rather unusual format in which this lecture is being conveyed to you. I was unable to record the lecture, the audio version of the lecture earlier today, and I had to miss the lecture slot due to a hospital appointment. So I'm doing this as an experiment to see whether it'll work in getting lectures to you when I'm unable to be there, which is possible for next week as well. So let me know how this works, and if you have any trouble with this format or with just following the lecture through a video format, please do email me, and my email address is e.grabham@kent.ac.uk. So you've probably already worked out that I'm Emily Grabham. I'm the convener for Labour Law and Law of the Workplace. We're also joined this year by Helen Strotton at Medway and Lacey Kerner at Kent. And both of their office hours are available, hopefully through the usual channels, although if you need them, please do email me as well, and I will try and sort that out. Now, a little bit of housekeeping for the first lecture. You can find your seminar booklet, and you can also find the general course outline on Moodle. And any further information that you're going to need during the year will also be posted on Moodle. Okay, so we'll try and keep up to date with that. What I'm going to cover in this first lecture is basically what's contained in the course. So I'm going to give you a short course overview. You'll probably already have a good idea about what's contained, but we'll go through it nevertheless. And also I'm going to cover course assessment, so just to explain how the course is assessed, what you're going to need to do and when you're going to need to do it. Next, we're going to have a look at putting labour law into context. So we'll look at some of the recent developments in the UK political and economic scene, and we will try and draw some parallels between some of the things that happened in the Great Depression in the 1930s and look at the role of unions in protesting and things like that, just to give you a bit of background on really what is at stake in studying labour law at the moment, because it's a great time to be studying labour law. And once we've done that, once we've put labour law into a little bit of context, we're going to start to look at the history of labour law. And it's really important to study the history of labour law, because otherwise we don't understand really where the rights and the responsibilities and the benefits that we get from labour law come from. We also don't understand where some of the restrictions and some of the failures of labour law come from as well. Okay, so you can get your lecture notes online, so hopefully you'll be able to get them on Moodle. That shouldn't be a problem, and maybe you're following the lecture notes as you're watching this, I don't know, but in any case, later on in the lecture I'll be referring to some video clips which I've posted on Moodle. I assume that the best way for you to look at those video clips is actually to wait till the end of this particular video and then to check those out, but it's up to you. You're probably way more technologically competent than I am, so I'll leave that to you. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is describing the labour law and law of the workplace curriculum. Okay, so we start with looking at the employment relationship in context, okay, and the regulation of dismissal. So we start, as I've already indicated, with some of the history of labour law. Okay, so we look at the early history of the unions, we look at the early regulation of labour law, we look at the early regulation of employment relationships and what types of regulation covered employment relationships. And we'll see, for example, that labour law used to be regulated by the criminal law, which is quite interesting, and then we look at how that shifted towards more of a tort-based relationship, and then we look at the role of the influence of legislation. Okay. So we follow that through, and then over the coming weeks we then move on to the more specific doctrinal law over how to define an employment relationship. And this is really important because basically the employment relationship is at the core of many of the rights that we think that we are owed within labour law. So unless you are an employee, you don't get access to the number of rights that you might commonly think that you have. So we'll look at the definition of an employee, we'll look at how that's been constructed over the years, the role of the courts in constructing that relationship. This is interesting because you might imagine that it's fairly straightforward to work out who an employee is, but these days we've got a much wider range of contracts. We've got 0 hours contracts, for example, we've got temporary contracts, we've got part-time contracts, we've got agency work, and many of you will have been engaged in doing agency work over the summer, so it's interesting to look at all these different types of contract and try and work out where they fit in the employment regulation matrix. Okay. One thing that we'll also look at that might be relevant to you is the rights and duties that people have once they're in employment. And one of the things that I find comes up every year with labour law students is that some of you won't have been paid over the summer for the work that you've done. And it's quite interesting to see how often that comes up. So we actually do veer off very shortly into looking at how people can get their money back, how people can get paid for the work that they've done in part-time work or in temporary work over the summer. Now that leads me on to the next main area, which is looking at the rights and duties owed in employment. So we look at the rights that employees have, and we also look at what employers can ask employees to do. So it's all about the terms of the employment contract, okay, and we try and figure out which of these terms might be implied by law as well. So some of them aren't expressed, some of them aren't put within the normal sort of paper contract that you might normally look at. Some of them are implied by the courts, so we look at the major terms that are implied. One of them, for example, is the implied term of mutual trust and confidence, which has recently been used to make it, or to prohibit employers in the city from swearing at their employees. Okay, so the implied term of mutual trust and confidence is developing in the common law, and it's providing more and more protection for employees, and we'll try and look at why that is over the coming weeks. Okay, so there's a particular direction to what's covered on this course. Having started with a bit of the context of labour law and employment law, we then look at what is at the core of the employment relationship, so who gets the best rights, as it were, the sort of core rights, the employee status, and then we look at worker status and things like that. Okay, so that is all about who's an employee, and then we move from who's an employee into what is the employment relationship, what's in that contract. Okay, so that's the beginning and the middle covered, but what about the end? So by the time we get to the end of this term, we'll be looking at the end of the employment relationship, and we'll be looking primarily at dismissals and redundancy. Now, many of you will be really aware that redundancy is extremely relevant at the moment with the current economic downturn. So we'll be looking at when in law employers are allowed to say that posts have become redundant. So that's one issue. And then once that is established by an employer, when the process that they then use to select employees for redundancy. Okay, so we'll look at all of those legal issues. We'll also look at unfair dismissal and wrongful dismissal. Unfair dismissal is the statutory protection from being dismissed, which is contained in the Employment Rights Act 1996, and wrongful dismissal is the dismissal regime at common law. Okay, and we'll look at how those two, well, basically who's covered by those two areas of the law and who it leaves out. We'll also look at how those two areas of the law fit together. Okay. Now, once we've done that, in the second term, we move on to two other really big areas of labour law. The first is equality law, and the second is collective action, or the law around union. It's basically union law. Okay, so when we're looking at equality, we'll start off with some of the conceptual issues, like how to define equality. You might think it's fairly simple and straightforward, but we'll find out that it's far less simple and straightforward than we might have wished. For example, you might assume that equality means treating likes alike, but then what happens if the people that you're treating alike, as if they were alike, are some of them are hampered by historical disadvantage? Okay, so we're going to start looking at the distinctions between formal equality, which is treating likes alike, and concepts such as substantive equality, which means making sure that all of the outcomes are equal. So we're aiming for equal outcomes. Okay, substantive equality is far more of a redistributive concept. Okay, so having looked at that, we'll then move on to the Equality Act 2010, which is a large piece of legislation that replaces all the previous bits of legislation in the area of equality in the UK. And what was happening over recent years, well, in fact, over the last 3 decades, was that successive pieces of legislation were coming in. The legislation was very piecemeal. People had different rights for different things, different levels of protection for different things. And eventually it got to such a point that the then Labour government said, okay, right, we're going to streamline all of this, put it into one act, right? So now, instead of having about 6 different pieces of legislation to memorise, you only have to memorise 1, which is good. So we'll look at that in the early part of the spring term next year. Okay, we'll also look at things like equal pay, and we'll look at work-life balance as well, so the laws around work-life balance and what rights parents have in employment. Now, the final part of the course is set aside for union law. Okay, so it's basically, we're looking at how unions are legally recognised, so the process by which groups of people can come together and be recognised as a union by their employer. And we also look at situations in which union members can legally strike or take other forms of industrial action. That's not at all straightforward following the reforms in labour law that were instigated at first by the Thatcher government in the 1980s and 90s, and then, to all intents and purposes, maintained by New Labour in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Okay, and it may well be that there are some reforms in union law over the coming period with the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, and we'll have to keep an eye out for that. Okay, and by the time we get to this part of the course, no doubt there will have been examples of quite a number of strikes, basically, over the next few months in various different parts of the economy. Then, only yesterday, for example, there was a general strike in Spain. Okay, so we'll look at what makes those strikes legal or illegal, and we'll also look at the age-old dilemma of how as workers do we ensure that our rights are best represented in the workplace, or if you're looking at it from a management perspective, what is the best way of ensuring a dialogue between management and the workers. Okay, so this becomes, every year it becomes quite controversial, so that's going to be fun towards the end of the course. Okay, so let's have a look now at course assessment. Probably you've downloaded or printed off your study guide, and so you'll see that the course is assessed by means of 20% coursework and 80% examination. Now, it's going to take me about 5 minutes to explain to you the coursework element, and you're thinking, what is the point of this? This is only 20% of my mark, but it can make the difference between your grades. So I would try and make an effort, if I were you, with the coursework. Every year students actually do improve their coursework grades throughout the year by just focusing on a couple of key points. So look at the feedback you get from earlier coursework and try and apply it to later coursework. And the coursework is as follows. We start in week 8 in the lecture slot with a multiple choice questionnaire. That's worth 5% of your overall mark. And that is basically intended to make sure that you're on the right lines with the way that you understand labour law. We've been running it now for a few years, and it works because it highlights where the areas of confusion are and what you might need to catch up on. Okay, that is then followed by a problem question, which is due in at the end of term. It's normally around 1,000 words. I will check that for you. And the problem question is very shortly going to be put up on Moodle for you. Okay, that's also worth 5%. Then we're looking at a sorry, I just said that problem question was due in at the end of term, and I'm pretty sure that it's due in January. Don't quote me on this. Go and have a look in the study guide because it's right there. Okay. Then we're moving on to an essay question of 3,000 words, which is due in April. And so that will if you didn't like the problem question, the essay question will give you a chance to maybe pick up a sort of a broader socio-political issue to do with labour law, or to look at something in more depth. So now a brief word on plagiarism. Every year labour law students, a couple of labour law students at least, get pulled up for plagiarism, and the reason is that quite often it might be because students have poor time management and have left the the problem question or the essay until very, very late before the deadline, panic, go online, Google something, cut and paste it, and then it gets pulled up by Turnitin, or it gets pulled up by one of the people marking the essay or the problem question. So I'd advise, please do start thinking about the assessments in advance and start thinking about how you're going to do them. Another tip is that when you're taking notes, try and remember where you get your material from. So make a note of where your material comes from and try and rephrase things into your own language, because if you do that, you're less likely to get pulled up for basically accidentally quoting somebody verbatim and not telling us that you've done that. Another thing that just generally, it isn't always plagiarism, but it doesn't look good, is when you realise that you're cutting and pasting, and so you put quotation marks around it and then you cite correctly. Now the problem with that is when you do that a lot, the person who's marking the essay is wanting to know what your own opinion is about the material and doesn't get a good sense of where you're coming from, and won't be able to give you a high mark. So it's better to write maybe a shorter essay with more of your own material in it than to write a longer essay with lots and lots of big chunks of material cut and pasted or quoted from somebody else, from somebody's book, for example. Okay, I'm very briefly going to cover the new and delightful practice for us as markers of people buying essays on the internet. You may have noticed this thing called lawteachers.net on the internet. I have certainly noticed it. Kent Law School is aware of it. Don't be tempted to go online and spend money on a labour law essay. For a start, it won't be very good. I know they say that they're going to get you a 2-1 or a first, but the kind of things that we set you to do over the next year are not standard. They're not the kind of standard labour law curriculum, so it's not going to get you a good mark even if they say they've sold you a first class essay. The other thing is it's pretty easy to tell, because you'll remember that if you're coming to seminars regularly, people have a sense of what your standard is, and obviously if you don't come to seminars regularly, then somebody in KLOS office will be in touch with you. It's all getting very it's a surveillance culture these days, but anyway. Okay, that's that over with. I don't want to talk about that anymore. So let's turn to the subject of this first lecture, putting labour law into context. Now, up on Moodle there are a few video clips, and the first one that I'd like you to look at either now or whenever you get a chance is the video clip of a protest in Brussels on the 29th of September 2010. So we're looking at a protest that took place yesterday. Now, the Brussels protest, a part of which is shown in the clip, was part of a coordinated day of strikes and protests organised by a range of unions against the austerity measures that are being brought in many European countries. Okay, and the centre of the protest was a No to Austerity march in Brussels, and it was organised by the European Trade Union Confederation. And there were unions representatives in Brussels from unions across Europe. Okay. The reason why we're looking at this is because what I'm trying to bring in is an awareness of current socio-political issues and the role that organised labour has in having its voice heard in those protests and in the opposition to the cuts. So what we can see is, as part of the political life of the UK, unions do have a voice, and they do have a lot. They do have a certain amount of strength. They don't have the same amount of strength as they had in the 1980s, but they're still very organised, and they still have a part to play. Okay, the reason why it's important to cover this is because the massive cuts in public spending will also obviously have an effect on the type of labour law we're looking at in the future. Okay, so there are probably going to be large numbers of redundancies over the next few years if the spending cuts come into force. This will change what the UK labour force looks like. So if we're thinking about the context in which labour law is operating, we'll see a change in how many people are employed and the type of work they're employed in. We'll also see, if people decide to take their claims to employment tribunals, we'll also see a rise in the number of unfair dismissal and unfair redundancy claims coming through the tribunals. Okay, but we might, in addition to that, see changes in how the law may be conceptualises a dismissal or conceptualises a redundancy. Okay, so this is part of the landscape in which current labour law is evolving at the moment. You may also have heard politicians within the Labour Party talking about the effect of the cuts on various groups of workers, in particular, for example, women and disabled people, because what is emerging is that the proposed cuts do have a disproportionate impact on women, because women are more likely to be employed in certain public sector jobs at certain levels, and so the type of jobs that are going to be shed over the coming years are going to be jobs that are traditionally undertaken by women. Okay. So have a look at the clip from the Brussels video. Okay. The other clip that's up there is there's a clip from Brussels. There's also a clip from Huelva in Spain. Have a look at that, and that just shows part of the action from the general strike that took place in Spain yesterday. And there's also a clip showing a protest by pensioners in Greece against the austerity measures that have been brought through in Greece. And you may already know about this, but in order to unlock loans of about 120 billion euros from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and other European countries in May this year, Greece approved a series of public sector cuts, so job cuts, pay cuts, pension cuts, and a hike in VAT from 20% to 23%, and all of these cuts put together were worth 30 billion euros. Okay, Greece was hit particularly hard by the recession because its borrowing costs were relatively high, which meant that its economy clogged up a lot quicker than the other European Union countries. And by the time the Greek Parliament approved the package and finally got the money from the IMF, Greece was in debt by 300 million euros. Okay, so it's just about to go bankrupt. Now, the video shows the protest that the pensioners undertook against the cuts in their pensions and the freeze in pensions. But also one of the issues that came up as part of the IMF deal was the hike in VAT. And you may already be aware from debates in the UK that when you increase value-added tax, which is a tax on bought items, it's a tax that has a disproportionate effect on people who earn little or no money and people who are on benefits. It's a tax on the low paid or the unpaid, because if you're in employment, put this a different way, every time you buy something, if you're paying that much more of a percentage tax, okay, and maybe let's say you earn £10 a day, and the cost of something goes up by another 3 or 4%, it's going to hit you much harder than it would do somebody who's on a much higher income. So a rise in VAT is seen as being a socially regressive tax rise, and this is something maybe the business law students will be able to talk about a lot more. Okay, now the reason why this is causing a lot of upset across the EU is that a lot of these austerity measures are seen as impacting the working poor. That is to say, people who are employed but are on very low wages. And the concept of the working poor is a very important concept as we go through the rest of labour law, because we can see that many of the reforms that have been brought in impact on the working poor, and that many people don't realise that they are part of this bracket. Okay, so finally there is on Moodle yet another video from YouTube about youth unemployment, and this is something that maybe you and your friends have been talking about, the fact that when, for example, university students get out of university, you're facing a higher level of student debt than any student body has before in the UK, but there's also an enormous amount of youth unemployment. In fact, it's relatively really quite difficult to get a job at the moment, and for people coming straight out of high school into a job, it's also very difficult. So there are bodies that are starting to protest on behalf of young people. Putting this into context, it's been very common for protests and strikes of this form to come about, and so the reason why I've put these clips on YouTube is to just show you that whenever we see on the news that these new cuts are coming in or some new government policy, it's not that it's not being opposed. There are a number of protests going on at the moment, and they are contributing to the way that we see labour law operating, which we'll get back to later on. There is a parallel to be drawn between the protests that are going on now around the austerity, or supposedly what we're supposed to believe is what is necessary. So we're supposed to believe that all of our economies are undergoing great strain, and that the best way to do that is to cut public spending. That's the sort of orthodoxy that the governments are churning out. And then there's another orthodoxy that's coming from another set of economists, which says that if you cut public spending, then you cut economic growth, and so it's harder for a country to emerge out of recession. Now, these debates are very similar to some of the debates that were being had back in the 1930s around the time of the Great Depression. Okay, I'm not drawing an exact parallel because obviously there are huge differences. For example, back in the 1930s, the manufacturing sector was much stronger in the UK, and there were large heavy industry sector was much stronger in the UK. So we can't say that there's an exact parallel, but some of these protests and some of the things that people were going out on the street and protesting about, and some of the things that workers were having to put up with, are quite similar. In October 1932, for example, the National Hunger March took place with around 2,500 people in 18 different contingents coming from different parts of the UK and marching on London. So some of them came from Glasgow, and some of them came from Wales, and some of them came from much closer to home. So have a look at the video of the Jarrow Hunger March on Moodle. That's some footage of the marchers getting into London. Now, the context of this march was that the UK at that point was going through the Great Depression, and the Great Depression was causing widespread unemployment, and as a result the government brought in a number of different measures. We can't cover all of them now. One of them was a means test for unemployment benefit. Another one was the Anomalies Act, which brought in widespread cuts in social services and a 10% cut in already meagre levels of unemployment benefit. Okay, and many of these marches, because there were a series of marches that started in the late 1920s and went through to the mid-1930s, many of these marches were organised by the National Unemployed Workers Movement. Okay, and looking particularly at the October 1932 march, by the time it reached London, it was greeted by about 100,000 people, and also, rather interestingly, around 70,000 police. So whenever we think we're the first generation to go through this, obviously we're not. And what's really quite telling is what was said in a manifesto for a march in 1934. And so I'm going to read this out to you. You've probably already got this in your lecture notes already, but some of the parallels are really quite interesting. So I'm going to quote from the manifesto for this march against the unemployment bill of the early 1930s. Okay. For over 2 years, the attack has gone on, and the national government has ridden roughshod over the interests of the working class. It has smashed down wage standards of teachers, civil servants, post office workers, the men in the armed forms, and the police. It has given every conceivable encouragement and assistance to the employers to still further reduce the living standards of workers in every industry. It has slashed the miserable benefit and relief standards of the unemployed. It has driven millions of our class into the most terrible conditions of poverty and destitution. It carried through vicious attacks under the false name of economy measures in 1931 and gave definite pledges that the cuts to wages and benefits levels were only temporary and would be quickly restored. It has flagrantly broken that pledge, and instead of using the huge financial surplus of which the Chancellor of the Exchequer now boasts to restore the living standards of the workers, it spends millions of pounds more on armaments and the preparation for new wars involving the slaughter of millions of workers in the interests of capitalism. Now, there are some differences between the rhetoric that we would get today from people who are protesting and the kind of words that we used. For example, the slaughter of millions of workers is not really something I think that people would talk about today. But a lot of the rest of it does have similarities. For example, there's talk about cuts in benefits, cuts in welfare benefits. Well, that is absolutely current today with the welfare reform measures that are the new waves of welfare reform measures that were brought in by the new Labour government towards the end of its term, and the new Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition right now. when they talk about the vicious attacks under the false name of economy measures, they're also talking about, obviously, the way that the economy and the problems with the economy is being held up as the reason why lots of public sector workers get their wages frozen, or there's going to be huge waves of redundancies in the public sector. Okay. So there are some similarities. You've probably got the picture by now. Okay. Now, labour law was very different in the 1930s to what it is now, but some of the economic problems look very similar. One of the central features of labour law is working out what are the contours of organised labour, what is a union, when is a union legal, what can a union do in order to protest against things that it doesn't like, so when can union members go on strike, when can they take other forms of industrial action. But another key feature of labour law is working out what are the circumstances in which working conditions can be improved for workers, and what are the circumstances in which employers can improve their own interests. Okay. Now, union activism has done a lot to improve the situation of working people in the UK. Whether that's been through collective bargaining, so more peaceful means, or whether that's through through protesting or lobbying government and things like that. So let's move briefly onto a list of, if we're going to take a historical view of labour law, let's have a look at unpacking some of the concepts that we consider our normal features of working life. So I'm going to list a few different things, and I'd like you to think about, as I list them, which ones of those have always been a feature of working life in the UK, or have been, you think, for at least maybe 300 or 400 years, and which of those things are maybe more recent. And also, while you're thinking about that, I'd like you to consider which of those things might have been brought about by unions, and which of those things have just been brought about maybe by employees requiring them from their employers in maybe individual circumstances and in less of a collectivist way. Okay, so the first one is the 8-hour working day. Okay, the second one is the weekend, the concept of the weekend, 1 or 2 days off. Equal pay laws, paid holidays, a restriction on child labour, laws against unfair dismissal, laws against homophobic bullying in the workplace, the minimum wage, and enough time off work to get a good night's sleep. And in fact, I'm going to add one to the end, which is, could you tell me whether you think the concept of a good night's sleep is something that labour law has something to do with? Now, in fact, all of these things were achieved with the help of either direct union activism or union lobbying of Parliament. Okay, so we'll start with maybe the weirdest first. Okay, so the idea that we have this thing called the working day, but also that the working day is bounded at either end by periods of rest, is something that was actually constructed at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, as unions started to organise more effectively and started to articulate their demands. So in order to agitate for the 8-hour working day, it was necessary to talk about what existed outside of that working day and why there needed to be limits on the amount of time that people could work. And so union activists got together with social researchers and people who were interested in health and hygiene and medicine, and came up with this concept of a good night's sleep. So we take that for granted now. We take that concept for granted, but it's something that only came onto the policy landscape in the early 19th century. Okay, other things like the minimum wage. Well, we know that's quite recent. And we know that the Labour Party is now talking about not just a minimum wage, but a living wage, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out as a policy suggestion. Laws against homophobic bullying in the workplace. Well, New Labour claimed credit for that. Those laws came into force in 2003, but they were actually required by European legislation, which was around from the early 2000s. Okay. So the reason why I'm focusing on this list is because I want to highlight right from the beginning just how recent this concept of working life really is, and how many of the things that we consider core parts of our working relationships and core parts of the way that even many people structure their week have been brought about by labour-related struggle, not just even broader social and political trends, but the way in which social research has been used by those interested in improving working life. Another way of looking at it is that even if you don't agree with union politics in particular, the labour law that we have today is a result of conflicts that have gone on in the past, okay, and the way in which power in the past was balanced between workers and employers. So we'll see, for example, that unions have to follow particular procedures before they're allowed to call their members out on strike. Well, those particular procedures were brought in by the Thatcher government. Or, for example, unfair dismissal law has been gradually improved over the years, and the amount of time you've had to be employed before you could claim unfair dismissal has been gradually reduced. That is as a result of pressure by unions and other interested parties on successive governments. But another point is, and I think I've already mentioned this, that the conflicts and crises that we're having today will influence the labour law of the future. And so what's going to be really interesting is to see what it's going to mean for labour law for a large number of redundancies to take place, what it's going to mean for the employment tribunal system, which is the adjudication system that covers labour law, what it's going to mean for that system for maybe a large number of people to be made unemployed in a relatively short space of time. So when we look ahead to the future, it's going to be interesting in 10, 20 years' time what this particular period of an economic downturn will have done to labour law as a concept. Okay, that's the broader concept. That's the broader context. Let's have a look at some early late forms of labour regulation. Okay, and the reason why I'm introducing this as a topic is just to show you quite how interesting it is that labour law is currently regulated through a mixture of the common law, contract, and statute. Okay, because it hasn't always been like that, and in particular, it's very, very interesting to me the way that early forms of regulation have maybe waned and new forms of regulation have taken their place, and with that a different set of power dynamics has come into play in the UK between employers and workers. So I'll just have a little sip of my tea. Okay, so what we have at the moment, as I've already said, is the concept of the employment contract, which as a contract means that each party has duties and responsibilities as part of the contract. You can imply terms into the contract. You can look at the contract, work out from the contract what the relationship is expected to be. So that's one part of labour law that we take for granted and that's very important. Another part of labour law is the fact that we have these statutes like the Equality Act 2010, for example, which puts obligations on employers to treat employees in particular ways. Now, some of those statutes come from the UK, so much of what's in the Equality Act came originally from the UK, but some of the things that we now consider to be part of the Equality Act 2010 actually originated from Europe, and then we had to pass laws in order to put those things into effect. And next week we'll look at, in particular, how that mechanism happens. That's the current system. By contrast, early labour law took the form of a corporative system in which local magistrates set wages and provided for the poor in their area. Okay, and much of this corporative system was based on the criminal law. So there was this thing called the Statute of Artificers in 1562. And this statute outlawed strikes and any collective action between workers intended to improve wages or conditions. So another thing to remember is that even if you think that unions are quite recent, they've been going in one form or another for hundreds of years, and they may not look anything like they did, but collective action, people combining in order to improve wages, combining in order to improve their terms and conditions of work, has been going on for a while, and we can see that as early as 1562, the government as it looked then, it wasn't exactly the same at all, felt it necessary to have a law that covered this sort of situation, okay, these sort of debates and dilemmas. But combining with your workmates in order to pressurise an employer for better terms and conditions was considered a criminal conspiracy in the 1500s. You could be prosecuted. In fact, many people were prosecuted. Now, later Acts of Parliament extended these restrictions trade by trade. So it wasn't the case that they had statutes that went that went all the way across England and Wales and applied to literally everybody. What they did was they took each trade in turn and they said, oh, by the way, now you now I don't know, cloth merchants aren't allowed to, well, obviously not the merchants, but the people who transport cloth are not allowed to combine and engage in union activities. And now let's have a look at the journeymen tailors, and they're not allowed to combine. And so they went through all the different types of work with successive acts of parliament. So between 1500 and 1700 you had this situation where gradually across the different trades it became progressively criminally unlawful to engage in union activities. Now, this is significant. The reason why I'm banging on about unions here is this is significant because pretty well the only form of law that applied to, the only form of labour law that applied to workers at that time was the labour law that stopped people from combining in unions. So pretty well the only way that you could have any power in your employment relationship was to either establish a union or to petition your employer yourself individually, which was hardly ever met with a good result. So it really wasn't the case that you had this concept of having individual rights. The concept of individual rights didn't come about until much, much later, and we'll have a look towards the end of this lecture about the difference between union organising as a way of visualising labour law as a concept, and the idea of a floor of rights models, and that will hopefully become a lot more apparent later on. But back to these statutes in the 1700s. Okay. For example, an Act of 1720 covered the journeymen tailors in particular and made any of their union agreements null and void and subjected union members to imprisonment. And even worse, if you left a job before your employer thought that the job had been done, you could be subject to imprisonment. Okay, so it really wasn't the case that individual employees had rights as against their employers. It was more that employers could use the criminal law to force workers to do what they wanted them to do, and could also use the criminal law to stop them from combining with their colleagues to improve their working conditions. Now, more legislation of this type followed, and in 1799 and 1800 the Combination Acts imposed a ban on combinations or collective action in total. So that between the period 1800 to 1867, collective action was tightly regulated, strikes were outlawed, and workers obviously were under continual threat of being imprisoned if they breached their contract of employment. Now, during that period of time, various delegations in Parliament were reconsidering this, and to cut a very long story very short, in 1867 the Master and Servant Act was supposed to make imprisonment a last resort for violating your contract of employment or for engaging in union activities, and instead it was supposed to bring in fines. But the problem with this was that it didn't cut the number of prosecutions that were being followed. It had hardly any effect. In fact, the numbers of prosecutions continued to rise. Okay, so you had this situation where employers were really very, very on the ball in terms of taking workers to court and prosecuting them. And on top of that was the decision of Hornby and Close in 1867, which held that trade unions were unlawful because they operated in restraint of trade. Now, this was this meant obviously that employers could seize unions' property. Now, this was a really, really interesting development because it's a very early example of the attitude of the courts and the common law towards collective action. Now, generally speaking, the courts and the common law have been very hostile to unions and to collective organising. As we'll see later on, governments haven't always necessarily been hostile to collective organising. Governments can see that it's a great way of industrial disputes being solved at arm's length from the government without the government having necessarily to intervene directly itself. But in those early years, the ways in which the courts were approaching these matters became increasingly hostile. And Simon Deakin and Gillian Morris, who've written a very good labour law textbook, and I've recommended the first chapter to you if you've got time to read it, and especially the first 30 pages are very good. I'd recommend going away and reading that. Simon Deacon and Gillian Morris explain this hostility by pointing out, first of all, that many of the lawyers who ran the common law system at that point in time came from a mercantile background, and they had very liberal economic views, so they believed in the concept of the free market. Now, if you believe in the concept of the free market, and if you believe in it very strongly, then one of the things that you're more likely to think is that unions are a drag on free negotiating and the way that parties just naturally negotiate with each other within a free market in order to achieve the optimal outcome. So you might see groups of people clumping together and insisting on certain rights as impeding the way that the market operates. So the judges came from this mercantile perspective. Okay, now later on we'll see that the economic and industrial torts, which was a set of torts that applied to unions in particular, was developed out of this early example of hostility towards unions, and it ended up having the result that collective action was regulated mainly through torts and immunities from torts. Okay, so you'll understand from tort law what tort law provides as a set of remedies, and what we'll see now is that the way that collective action is allowed in the UK is through a statutory immunity from that body of tort law that developed over the 18th and 19th centuries. Okay. Nevertheless, despite all of this, a Royal Commission of 1875 decided two things that were going to put unions on a more stable footing. The first was that it was more important for unions to be able to organise than it was to allow employers to rely on restrictive trade arguments to stop them from operating. And we can see, as I've already said, that governments can see a lot of good in unions being able to negotiate with employers direct without too much government intervention. And the second thing was that employees breaching their employment contracts should not lead to criminal prosecution. So there's a spelling mistake, I apologise, in the lecture notes. Okay, so what the Royal Commission was trying to do was to say, well, actually, we can see some good in unions being able to operate, and we also think that it's problematic to use the criminal law in these circumstances. So then we had the Employers and Workmen Act 1875 and the Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act 1875. You're not going to need to remember these in any way, but they do provide an example of where we're going in terms of the history of labour law. So I will leave you to read about those in more depth, and I will basically sum up this particular section by saying that the 1875 legislation established the foundations of a system that dominated our regulation in the UK of working life and workplace conflict for the next 100 years at least, and it still has significant influences today. Okay, so those two pieces of 1875 legislation basically said collective bargaining is okay, and it set up a train of thought and a government attitude in policy and practice which allowed collective bargaining, and didn't just allow collective bargaining but saw collective bargaining as a central feature of the operating of the economy, and also for that reason as a central feature of the way that labour law works. Okay, so it set up the system of collective bargaining, the idea that employers have to negotiate working conditions and pay with unions, and that these collective agreements are a central source of workplace rules. But the legislation also founded the idea that these agreements are not enforceable in law, and we'll go on to cover that later. An important principle, this is an important principle, but it doesn't stop the collective agreements it doesn't stop employees being able to rely on provisions of collective agreements as provisions of their contract. But we'll leave that to one side. And finally, it set up the idea that unions had and still have immunities which operate like defences from the common law torts which were being developed through the courts by employers to attack unions. Okay, these immunities were and still are based on the presumption that trade disputes are allowed and protected through the law. We'll come back to those immunities at the end of the module, but they are contained in a large piece of legislation that's called the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act 1992. Okay, so we've got about 5-10 minutes left. Okay, so we can see that during most of the 20th century, collective bargaining provided the overwhelming source of industrial agreements, norms and rules, so much so that labour law itself was intimately bound up with the collective bargaining practice. Now, in 1959, the famous and very influential labour lawyer Otto Kahn-Freund described the situation as one of collective laissez-faire, which means that the state created the conditions in which bargaining could happen and encouraged bargaining through its own policies as an employer, but it didn't require agreements to be enforceable or impose other rules on the process. So the state as an employer would go into union negotiations and try to set up good practice, but apart from that, it was going to leave unions and employers to get on with it. Now, the interesting thing about collective laissez-faire is that it stood in contradistinction to other forms of labour regulation that were emerging in other European countries at the time. Now, other European countries followed a floor of rights type model. Now, it's not to say that unions didn't exist on the continent, but rather that from much earlier on, what unions were able to achieve was the idea of minimum labour standards. So you'd have a piece of legislation that covered all workplaces and that put in minimum standards, like, for example, the 8-hour working day, and sometimes it even went as far as providing for minimum wage type situations. Okay. In the UK, in contrast to this, whilst an increasing amount of legislation was governing working life, so it's not like we didn't have that type of legislation, there was no concept that a floor of rights itself was the driving force for labour law. Okay. Instead, a large aspect of labour regulation was seen through the lens of voluntarism, the idea that parties would achieve standards through negotiation. These days, legislation plays a much bigger role in determining working conditions and employees' rights. So collective laissez-faire took hold in the UK for two main reasons. So we're looking at why did we have this collective laissez-faire model that was quite different from other countries. Now, the first reason was governments were in favour. The first reason was that the type of floor of rights type legislation, which in the UK was the Factories Act, which I'll come on to in a minute, that type of floor of rights type legislation wasn't extended into a labour code as such for a number of reasons. The second reason was because successive governments actually did take steps to support collective bargaining, and so there was a general move towards allowing collective bargaining and supporting it. We'll go back to the first reason. Okay, the Factories Act of the 19th century, so there's lots of different types of legislation, were the first type of modern industrial legislation anywhere in the world. Okay, and they formed the basis for many countries' own attempts to regulate labour standards. So the Factories Acts in the UK were used as the blueprint for industrial legislation abroad. Now, the Factories Acts were concerned with improving the working conditions and working hours of children and women in particular. So, for example, the Mines Regulation Act 1842 prohibited women from working underground, and the Factories Act 1842 gave women the same working hours as children under 18. These acts were necessary because factory unions were very weak in this period and couldn't achieve improvements in working conditions on their own. And whilst legislation didn't cover men in this period, nevertheless male workers benefited from the higher standards, because it was much more difficult to apply different standards to different groups of people after these acts came into force. But from 1870s onwards, until the period just after World War II, social legislation like the Factories Acts was used less and less to set labour standards, because collective bargaining was in effect securing a better deal for unionised workers. So actually what was happening was, despite the fact we had this wonderful legislation, the point about it was it set a minimum standard which applied to women and children. Women and children often weren't unionised, and the unions were actually going through the negotiation, getting a better deal for their own, mainly male workers. For this reason, employment legislation itself was seen as a safety net to catch those who didn't have the negotiated rights, instead of a floor on which employers were expected to build. Now, the second reason why collective laissez-faire took off in the UK was because UK governments supported trade union organisation and bargaining. The Trades Union Congress, or TUC, which is still in operation today, was founded in the late 1860s, and it covered all the unions in different sectors of work. This new, strong, representative body undertook coordinated campaigns and lobbied hard for universal floor of rights type legislation, in particular an 8-hour working day. But at that point, when they were first starting in the late 19th century, they weren't yet successful. Okay, so having said that, you could in theory contrast the floor of rights type model with the collective laissez-faire model. Once people were in the collective laissez-faire model and doing their negotiating and doing their bargaining, what unions actually still wanted was the safety or the security of universal labour standards. So we can see that whilst I'm trying to sum up all of the developments that happened over the 18th and 19th century, it's very, very difficult to just see it all, because there are quite a lot of caveats. But during this period, collective bargaining took place at different levels in different sectors for different industries until just after World War II, when the government set up wages councils, which set wages, holidays and working hours, and joint industrial councils, which facilitated collective bargaining between unions and employers or employers' organisations. So to sum up, I've got 4 minutes left and I'm not going to use it, you'll be glad to hear. We've covered the early history of labour law, and we've seen that what started off as a set of locally enforced criminal laws covering workers who either didn't do their jobs properly, or left their jobs before they were completed, or coordinated with other workers. That type of locally administered criminal law shifted from the 1500s up until World War II to a situation in which the concept of collective laissez-faire meant that governments were happy for unions to negotiate with employers and that they would support that situation. So whereas we started with a situation where unions were criminally unlawful, and it was really dangerous to associate with other employees in combining to get better wages and conditions, we moved to a situation in the 1900s, and yeah, that's the 20th century, isn't it? I'm having a maths problem today. In the 1900s, where basically the government expects unions to negotiate with employers, it supports unions, and in fact, in many cases, it expects that this bargaining process itself will provide enough of a safety net for employees. So unions go from being unlawful to being a central part of the government's economic policy and central part of trade policy, but also they get the government out of having to provide particular minimum labour standards. Okay, so we'll finish there for now and we'll pick up the story next week. Thank you very much.